wonder if you could describe the circumstances that brought you to the decision to leave the United States. That is a place to begin.
Yeah, that's a good place. I'd say that what happened was that in the community in which we were living, there was a small friends meeting, and we had a discussion group as well as a meeting for worship. And one of the topics that we undertook to study and discuss was a pamphlet called Gandhi as a Revolutionary. And that affected us a great deal in terms of our thinking of the difference between being really effective and just thinking you were effective. And as we looked around us, we felt we had a growing feeling, the people in the Friends meeting essentially, that what I consider excellent projects that we were involved in were moving forward in community building in the Tracey community in which we lived. There was a community co-op, there was a community association which acted similarly to a Chamber of Commerce. And all of these things were thriving and moving ahead, but taking a worldview of it, we felt that the United States was a carpet that was being gradually pulled backwards faster than we were moving forward. So as long as we only looked at the carpet, it looked like we were making progress. But when we looked at beyond the carpet, it was being pulled backwards. And that carpet involved materialism, political McCarthyism, to use a word that wasn't famous at that time, but was soon to be, and a general attitude that the ends justify the means, that the idea is to get ahead, never mind how you do it. I think probably for the purposes of this, don't need to go into a lot of details as examples, but there are a number I could rattle off.
This was in 1948 or 49?
This would be 48, 49, 50, 51. And at that point, we began exploring to see how much different it would be if we were to go to Washington and Oregon or to go clear out of the country. And we gradually drifted over to a feeling that it would be better to get clear out of the United States. And by 1952, well, actually by 1951, we had decided on the West Kootenays. In other words, square about 100 miles on the side, bordered by the U.S. border, the mountains on the other side, and it included the Arrow Lakes, the Slocan, and the West Kootenays, the Kootenay Lake area. And so by 1952, we were ready to narrow down something smaller than 100 square mile. I mean, 100 miles square to something specific. And so after 3 automobile trips, the different configurations of people took up into the general area of BC, Northwest, we felt that we had enough information to follow down leads as to where we would eventually settle. Now, do you want more than that? Or?
Well, who was we? Did all the people?
The we involved ended up by being three families that were members of the Tracey monthly meeting of the Society of Friends, who had been working closely together. To name them, Bob and Ruth Boyd and their family, John and Ann Rush and their family, and John and Helen Stevenson and our family. Coincidentally, in January of 52, George and Mary Pollard and their family had decided quite independently of the thinking that we'd gone through, but for many of the same reasons, to leave Southern California and the cooperative community in which they were living, and to move to Canada, probably the Vancouver region. And they had just packed up and started north. And if my memory serves me correct, it was right around the 1st of January, maybe a little later, but not more than a few days from then. They were going up to Vancouver, and we said, well, we're going exploring in the spring. Why don't you wait 2 or 3 months and go with us? And if you like what we find, maybe that would be interesting. If you don't, you can go to Vancouver from where we're going. But they were people who had rural experience as well as urban experience. So actually, the people who came up first to explore for a short time, for a few weeks, was the Pollack family and the Stevenson family. And we were joined probably the last few days of April, and spent about a week we were joined by Bob Boyd and John Rush, who were, and all 4 of us went around exploring the things that we had not checked out, and some of the things that we had checked out that looked good. And so that it ended up being the 4 families, but it was the 3 families, the Rushes, the Boyds, and the Stevensons who were the ones who came with a lot of cerebral prelude to it, and the Pollards just didn't feel it was right to be where they were, and so they just came.
Were there others involved in the planning who never did actually make the move?
Well, it's a peculiar situation, yes and no. Not in Tracey. I don't think in Tracey anybody seriously thought of pulling up stakes. We were all well established and had been working on long-range projects. But there was a group in Modesto which was also looking restlessly the same way that our group was working, and it was in fact one of their carloads that gave us some of the earliest information and leads. And it included a person who eventually came to Argenta, who was Elmo Wolf. And he went with a group that went up and explored, in particular, their main destination, although they looked around some. Their main destination was the Needles Fauquier area in the Arrow Lakes, where there was a cooperative community struggling to get started there.
There was a cooperative community at Needles.
Actually, it was at Fauquier.
Was it a religious community?
No, not in the very strict sense. It consisted of Dorothy and Steve Norvell, Cindy Norvell's father and mother, and David and Ruth Orchid, and Junior and I don't remember his wife's name, Kunze. There were 3 families that had come from the States. They were all, I think, at least 2 out of 3 of them were actually draft resistors that early.
From the post-war draft, the
52. So they had come up in about 50, so it was post World War I, but it was probably the Korean draft.
Were these friends in Modesto, Quakers, as well?
Elmo was not a member of the Society of Friends. The Patoshniks are friends, but they were part of a cooperative community in Modesto, which was centered on a farm. It was called Tuolumne Farms, and which I think is since dissolved. But they were a cooperative group. They moved from the cooperative farm to a cooperative builders organization, and I'm not sure whether Rudy Patoshnik is still part of a cooperative builders organization or whether it's become a private, whether it's dissolved too. That's just history, I don't know what.
So you settled on your 100 miles square,
right?
Square, and then in the spring of 1952 you came.
Right. We left on St. Patrick's Day and arrived at the border on April Fool's Day, which is probably significant.
Where did you arrive first?
We came through the Rikers, the customs through south of Creston. How much are you interested in little details that are colorful?
Oh, if they're colorful on the screen.
Well, I got out of the car and went into the customs immigration office, which is no longer an immigration office, and there was a young immigration officer standing at the window looking out at the quote highway, one-lane dirt road, coming in, and what in his eyes, here was a caravan of 3 Model A Fords, which in 52 would be approximately 20 to 23 years old, in a row, 2 of them hauling trailers, and a huge overloaded 1939 Chevy truck, and all with California license plates. And he was sort of mildly shaking his head and saying, "You're not going to tell me you drove all of those things clear from California." And I assured him that we were, and that we wanted to immigrate. And so that was our arrival in Canada.
And you got your immigration at the border?
Yes. Minor detail, it was too late in the afternoon for him to do all the paperwork, so he let us in, and we went back the next day and immigrated right there, with no forewarning, no point system, no nothing.
And then you proceeded where?
Up to Kootenay Bay, actually to Walker's Landing, which is now the site of the Yashodhara ashram. And we had corresponded with isolated friends who lived there, and they offered us the opportunity to camp on their property while we were looking around, and that was our headquarters for 6 weeks, from the 1st of April till, actually it was the 10th of May when we actually landed in Argenta to stay.
Could you describe a little bit how you got from Walker's Landing to arrive in Argenta on the 10th of May?
You mean decision? What sort of things we did?
Yeah, how you made the decision.
As I said, George Pollard and I, and sometimes Helen and Mary, but more often just George and I, went around talking to people, asking them about land. We were primarily interested in having what might be called one small farm amongst us, somehow or another, so that if there were a major depression, we were all depression people, that all of us could pitch in and intensively work a farm. Not that all of us would maintain a living from the farm. We thought in terms of a farm that might support one person. So our search was for rural land with the potential of one small farm and then other residences or potential residences near that farm, with an idea that it was certainly optimistic and probably a certain amount of bravado that we just assumed that we could somehow or another make a living and survive in a strange place without knowing in advance where that strange place was going to be. But at any rate, that was the idea, so that some area acreage was necessary. We looked at places like the Hinks place in Crawford Bay, which is related to the Hinks family that lived up in Hauser, Captain Hinks, and he had an old mansion, really, with 4 chimneys, 4 fireplaces. He said that he used to burn at least 10 cords of wood a winter, but it had area around it, but it was too expensive. And typical Englishman's mansion and estate. And we drove up, George and I drove up and down the Arrow Lakes, the Slocan Lake, and up Kootenay Lake as far as Caslow, and talked to people about what sort of communities the communities were like, where they were, where people were, what people felt were the strong points and weak points of the communities in which they were living. And we eliminated a number of things that we'd gotten leads on from various places as being unsuitable, like the Hinks place. And we looked a little bit at Creston, and but actually it turned out that by that time the Creston Flats had been developed, and it was becoming a very high-priced land situation in that area.
So the expense forced you into more remote areas?
Expense was what chose this particular area, yes. None of us had a lot of money at that time. Our total capital was, John and Helen Stevenson's total capital was $3,000, which we'd gotten from selling our little house and place that we had in Tracey, California. Bob Boyd had more resources, and John and Ann Rush had fewer resources. And I don't know what George and Mary Pollard had, but they had probably a few $1,000s savings. So that there was no hope of buying land at premium prices. Mm-hmm. And so then when Bob Boyd and John Rush joined us, the four of us drove up and down the same valleys. And in addition to that, because Bob, in some of his correspondence, and through the recommendation of the Browns, at whose place we were staying in Walker's Landing, we hired a boat and came up to the Lardeau Valley, and as a matter of fact, I wish we could check that with somebody. I think we brought a car up on the barge, so that we could. I think we were driving the Model A around the valley, and we looked at places in Meadow Creek, and they looked quite good to us at first. But one person showed us around quite a large acreage, something, if my memory is correct, something in the neighborhood of 625 acres, 625 acres, and a good deal of the time we were wandering over huge cottonwood windfalls and down into water. And while we didn't know much about the fellow kept telling us about how valuable the land was because it had all these cottonwoods on it, which someday soon would be merchantable timber. And we didn't know a thing about logging, but we did know enough about land to know that something drastic would have to be done to land that you had to wade through. So we asked this particular individual if he would be, since he knew something about logging, we didn't, if he'd be willing to sell just the 65 or 100 acres that was high and dry to us. And that immediately became very expensive, and we backed off. I've heard rumors that somebody else who offered us land, I laugh at the price now, $65 an acre sounded high to us then. And I've heard a rumor that the land assessor heard the price he was asking for the land and raised his tax assessment after that. So I suspect that if that's true, we weren't very popular because we didn't take any of the Meadow Creek land that was offered to us. Then we came around to Argenta and looked around in Argenta. Probably the key to our staying in Argenta, other than the fact that we had a feeling that it was a much healthier community than any of the others we visited, was the fact that Andy Shuddy, who founded Shuddy's Bench, the old man, owned 300 or 320 acres, a quarter section, half section of land, offered it to us for $10 an acre. Not only that, whereas other people were asking for huge deposits, non-refundable, he offered us the land at a rent of $5 a month, and the 300 acres, and suggested we try out a small crop of potatoes in a little area that had been cleared, and went even farther and said, if you do decide to buy it at $10 an acre, you can take the $60 rent off of the purchase price after a year of trying it out. So there was land that we were sure was within our scope. It
Did
did.
he just take a liking to you, or what?
No, he was that kind of a guy. He didn't need the land, and he didn't. Figured he was growing old, and what was the use of holding out until he could make a killing on it? Whereas another factor was that every place we went in Meadow Creek and asked, can we, after we turned them down on buying anything right away, we said, can we rent something and try things out for a year? And the answer was no, because if I got a sale in the meantime and somebody wanted immediate occupancy, then I'd be stuck with a rental for the year. So the second factor that tipped us toward trying Argenta for a year was the fact that when we arrived here on this place, this acre and a half, the old Argenta hotel plus a cabin on the place were vacant. The owner of it was willing to rent it to us on the basis that he found out that Helen was a potential school teacher, and that the group of us, if we came, would bring in plenty of students to reopen the one-room school that was here. And he had grandchildren that were on correspondence, had been for several years. And so he was quite congenial and was willing to rent us the area from the wharf to the creek approximately. And so we had housing, we had a potential farm, and at about around the 5th of May, I think it was, we made the decision that Argenta was our first stop in the Kootenays.
But it was rents, and it was
only for a year, and it was on a rental basis.
What was your thinking at that time, that you had burned your bridges behind you? So
we burned our bridges behind us. We had to start somewhere, and we'd try to get better acclimated to the area, look around, see if something else turned up that we could drive to, go to, look at.
Did you continue to look around? Or did you
you see, the first two people that arrived and settled were George Pollard and Mary and John and Helen Stevenson and their families. And almost within weeks of arriving, George found, just to give you a notion, the property with his lakefront, that's probably 600 feet of lake frontage, was for sale for $3,000, just to give you an idea of the prices. We couldn't afford it because we had to live on something, but we were offered it $1,000 down and $1,000 a year with no interest. This is the sort of business arrangement people made. George and Mary found that 26 acres of land was with a very primitive two-story, one room on the bottom and one room in the top log house, was available for something, I think, $625 for 27 acres of land. And very quickly they bought with the intention of staying here. And within the year, we did some calculation. We were paying $50 a month rent. And we calculated we could walk away from the place in 5 years if we bought it and quit paying rent. Even if the property were unsaleable, we would only be stuck here for 5 years should the group decide to move on. And so we bought. And so George had no reason for doing any more exploring. Helen immediately became involved in preparing, while we were preparing during the summer to get a little garden in and get settled in this house that had been unused, and the hotel, and then she was teaching school, so that we were pretty well stuck to right here. When the next family that moved up were Bob and Ruth Boyd, who came that fall, and in time to get their kids into school. And by that time, they were getting settled, and we made inquiries, but we certainly didn't do the scouring of the countryside that we did before that. And before the year was out, we had all decided that we would stay on in Argenta for a longer period of time and try to be as flexible as we had been before about picking up and leaving. Mm-hmm. So that it was a tentative decision, but it may not. It very rapidly changed over.
What was Argenta like when the first time you saw it? How did it differ from today?
Oh my! Well, first place, the only way to get in here was by water. There were roads from here to Meadow Creek to Lardeau, but from Lardeau south to Caslow, there was no through road. There was a road into Shuddy's Bench, so there were about a dozen miles of non-road. They were actually on their second year of building a very narrow one-lane winding dirt road across that 12 miles, but it wasn't there. So that was the first thing. Everything came in and out by sternwheeler. I'm sure Helen mentioned the fact that the whole community came down on Saturday when the sternwheeler came in, unless somebody was sick. And so it was both a community event and a transportation event. Mail, visitors, freight, livestock, anything that came that way. There were, I keep saying half a dozen. I'd have to count on my fingers, half a dozen households. Let's see, the Sawziks and the Begwins were the only people about our age. That would be George and Joyce Begwin and Steve and Dorothy Sawzik. Then there were three older generation families. The older Begwins, George and Ruth Begwin, Charlie and Ruth Begwin, and Billy Sawzik, and I don't know his wife's name. Shows how much of a strong character he was in a receding Mrs. Sawzik. And
her real name was Pashkova.
Yeah, it's probably why I never learned it. And but she was Mrs. Sawzik, and he was Billy Sawzik to everybody in the neighborhood. And Mrs. Gallus, she's the one whose family built the house that the Valentines are now in. So there were three older families, representatives, and then there was Billy McLanders, who lived out around the corner here, who was a single man, and that was the Argenta population, unless you counted Tom Bulmer and his wife, who
they were still here
who lived 2 miles down a trail from here, and only came here by boat or by trail. And when I say who, I should say it was Tom Bulmer, because his wife by that time was quite disturbed and hid any time any visitors came and never ventured out of the place.
What about Tars up to the top?
I'm sorry, I missed the Tars. They were the third family that were our age. Pete and Kathleen Tar. Actually, I think his name's Carl A. Tar. And they lived clear at that time at the end of the road. So that makes actually 7 households, doesn't it? I think so.
Was there any remnants of the old post office between where Mottners live now? Was there anything in there?
Nothing that I know of. I didn't know there was a post office up there.
That was
bush, it would have been not visible, and our kids explored a lot, but I didn't do much exploring because I immediately became a housewife. And when Helen took over the school, and nor was there any evidence of any of the buildings that there was supposed to be. Some people told us there was a CPR office out on the point that's always crumbling between here and the bakery. There were evidences of the establishment that's up the hill. and there were sort of clearings and a few remnants of logs that Mrs. Kettlewell genteelly commented as being the houses for the lady who lived for the convenience of the miners. And that's up the hill from as you go from our house to the bakery. Mm-hmm. But that's the only remnants that I remember seeing. And so I didn't. At that time, the post office was the one-room school, which was where we're sitting approximately.
Mm-hmm. Well, what was the Delta Co-op?
When we came up here,
Delta Co-op.
Right. When we came here, none of us had any preconceived ideas about working closely together in any structured way. So that I just say this because people say, well, when you came here, you were planning a Delta Co-op, you were planning a friend school, and none of these were planned in advance. We really were coming blind and figuring we'd figure out what was reasonable to fit the environment that we found. We didn't know what the environment we were going to find was.
You did have a predisposition to cooperatives from your...
We had a predisposition to cooperatives, and we had a predisposition to education because of our background. As far as the co-op was concerned, it became evident after a couple of years that in order for all of us who had moved up to survive and stay here, we would have to have some sort of an overall structure that would keep us fed at a minimal basis. And so we began to talk about what kind of a structure we would like and what's going to be done with this tape. The first real attempt at semi-cooperative business operation was a very loose situation whereby a group of us got together and helped the Pollards set up a chicken business. They were going to have maybe 1,000 hens and sell eggs in Nelson and raise their chickens from day-old chicks. And we had a pilot project going with about 500 chicks. And my memory, no, I'm sure that was right. The first 500 chicks were destroyed by a fire which burnt their house and their brooder setup. Incidentally, this was our first taste of Canadian businessmen when we wrote and asked for some more chicks from the chicken breeders in Cloverdale. They wrote back, and they either sent them free or sent them at no markup from their raw costs. Mm. Either one. They took compassion on the Pollards because they'd had a loss. But we had by that time built the large barn that's on the Pollards' place, and when the house burned and the brooder burned, we worked very hard to keep it from burning, and it was the only thing that survived, really. So that then they reestablished and brooded some more chicks, and started in the chicken business. But it turned out that George was allergic to chickens, and he got nosebleeds, and it became quite clear that he was not going to survive in the chicken business. And we encouraged him to get out as quickly as he could. And so I don't remember the exact timing of that, but that project collapsed. So the next project that was taken as a group basis, oh no, that's not true. The next project that was taken on a group basis was the building of the Argenta Elementary School. And while the Argenta Elementary School was being built by George Pollard, Bob Boyd, Elmo Wolf, who moved here by then, and George Begwin, John Rush, people began talking about a cooperative that would support as many people as wanted to join it. George Begwin was involved in some of the discussions, but decided he didn't like meetings. And the group, if I'd say it had one glaring weakness, was probably that we talked about things until they were completely worn out rather than venturing forth on anything. And I suspect that the Delta Cooperative could have gone into half a dozen operations and succeeded if we'd taken the plunge instead of talked about it until we convinced ourselves that they wouldn't work. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So that we gradually worked out a plan which fitted our needs, which would give minimum security to everybody who wanted to join the cooperative, but gave a maximum amount of individual independence to the people. We looked at many of the cooperative patterns, such as the Bruderhof. I don't know whether you're familiar with that. And other communities, Macedonia community. We knew about the Tuolumne Cooperative Farm in near Tracey in Modesto, so that we were all familiar with a number of cooperative ventures. But what we came up with was basically an arrangement which paid very bare subsistence to every family that belonged to it in exchange for half of the working week. And the other half of the working week belonged to the individual to do with as he chose. So that assured that all of us, the Pollards, the Rushes, the Stevensons, the Boyds probably didn't need Delta Co-op particularly, and certainly Hugh Elliott, who came at about the time this was being formed, needed it not at all, except insofar as it was the kind of association he felt was moving in the right direction socially. So that it became you could call it a producers co-op, which was willing to do almost any kind of work that we felt was honest. And we did limit ourselves to work that could be done in the area. We wouldn't take any jobs that took a man away from, or a woman away from his family for more than one overnight. So that we wouldn't take a job building a house in Caslow at that time, because there was no way you could commute to Caslow. It was a 50-mile trip. Mm-hmm. And so that was the beginning of Delta Co-op. It had a number of things that are relatively modern insofar as women's lib's concerned. The policy was that anyone who worked for Delta Co-op, regardless of sex, skill, age, who worked full-time with the co-op, his hours were worth whatever anybody else's hours were worth. And we also had a policy that anybody who felt that he was needed at home more than he was needed on the job just phoned up the foreman of whatever job was being done, said, "I won't be there because my family needs me today," and there were no questions asked. So that and there was a minimum amount of bookkeeping of time. Unless somebody left for a month or something, then they wouldn't pick up their minimum allowance.
There was logging on a large scale going on at that time, wasn't there?
We did some logging. We were very lucky. We had taken up this 300 acres I mentioned earlier, and the only kind of stuff that was growing on it was a miserable stand of larch and fir, which were tall and skinny. I've counted the rings on trees that were less than 6 inches across that were 100 years old. So that they were not what you would call merchantable timber. But it happened soon after forming Delta Co-op that there were some sort of storms in the States, hurricanes or something, so that a large number of power poles went out. And for the first time, and the only time that I know of, there was a sudden demand, in addition for every cedar pole that you could get, for what were called hardwood poles, namely larch and fir. And these trees that were growing up in the north part half of the, well, more than half, the north 3/4 of the 300 acres were saleable. And we bought a little, probably about the smallest at that time, track layer John Deere tractor, a little thing about the size of a compact car, and proceeded to get into logging, about which we knew practically nothing. And we had exciting experiences, such as having a boom of the logs break out in the lake when we had a storm and during high water, and rushing around and collecting the logs for a second time all the way from here to Johnson Landing by boat. But we definitely logged for several years. First the hardwood poles, and then some cedar off of the north part of the land. And then we actually got a what was called a farm woodlot, which was an area that was north of Hamel Creek, which is now Ken Serena's area. And that was considered to be the best cedar pole growing area in the Lardeau Valley. And we were able to take some poles out of there during winters.
For sale to Lardeau.
For sale, yeah. But in addition to the logging, we built buildings. We built, I don't remember whether the Jewett School, that was the mirror image of the Argenta School up the hill, which is now the Rural Center, was built by Delta Cooperative or the same group of people. I mean, they would be the same group of people anyway. Chuck Valentine was involved in Delta Cooperative at this time. Or whether or not the Jewett School was built by the cooperative or the precursor, which was the same group. Plus, I think George Begwin did work on the Jewett School, so it probably was not Delta Cooperative. But we built houses, when there were houses in the area to be built, that people wanted to pay for. And we, the tractors, the various tractors that we acquired were used for road work on occasion. And we worked on bridges and wharves when work arose for that. But in addition to that, when there was no cash income, we worked on developing the south end of this property that I mentioned earlier that Andy Shuddy had offered for $3,000. Mm-hmm. And we cleared 60, 70 acres. It's the area that Roy Lake owns south of the Smith Boyd property. And we started out with 10 head of cattle, and we're just beginning to develop a small herd when Delta dissolved. Why did
the co-op dissolve?
Well, you have to ask. I'm sure you get a different answer from each person. Mm-hmm. My general feeling is that it was simply that one by one, various families got involved in other things that they found slightly more interesting than Delta Co-op. Mm-hmm. The Stevensons became very involved in the Friends School. The Pollards became postmaster and later on postmistress when George was over age, which was lighter work than. And both the Pollards and the Stevensons did sporadic short-term work, particularly in the summertime, with Delta. Delta was still in existence. Elmo Wolf left Argenta to go to Vernon for a period of time on a trial basis while his son was going to school, because his son wanted to go to a school where he was in a larger school than Jewett. So that left Chuck Valentine left under very difficult conditions from the co-op. He had been poisoned by DDT and had become neurasthenic and was having a good deal of difficulty relating to the members, or the members were having difficulty relating to him. And he was asked to leave the co-op, which caused a lot of hard feeling and misunderstanding, which I'm sure has not been cleared up yet. Hugh Elliott still would have liked to have been involved in the co-op, but he took a spell of writing plays after the co-op dissolved. And Bob Boyd, younger daughter, wanted to go to college, and he decided he needed to earn more money than he was getting from Delta Co-op, and so he undertook to teach music in Crawford Bay, Ainsworth, Caslow, and Meadow Creek, and therefore was on the road and had a full-time job, and therefore was only able to work on the co-op part-time.
Mm. So people went another direction.
So that people went in different directions. Now, whether there were underlying motives that the co-op didn't fulfill deeper desires, and therefore other things look more interesting or not, I'm not here to say.
But it was always, by and large, one short-term work after another bit of short-term work. It did not establish a solid financial.
That's right. We experimented with hogs, raising them out in the field on range. We had an idea that maybe they'd be a little bit healthier breeding stock if we could reach the point where we had the quality that would be breeding stock. But we did an experimental run on hogs for several years, and again, we were probably just too cautious. Also, I suspect that raising hogs out on the open range is not what many people are willing to support with premium prices. And as I said, we had a small herd of white-faced cattle that were just getting started after we gave up on the hogs. We talked endlessly about raising berries or sour cherries and freezing them and setting up a freezer, because during this period of time, Hugh Elliott, in addition to being a member of the co-op, had built his little power plant, which was at that time serving 12 families with lights, and had built the community freezer, which is still running. And we were turning over in our minds possible uses of a freezer and a crop of some sort, and we were just too good at seeing all the disadvantages. We looked at shake making, for instance, and took the advice of several people that you couldn't make a living on shakes. And if you look around the valley now, there must be half a dozen people that are making shakes and seem to be living. So that I think that this is part of our cerebral business, that I think we were just too cautious and thought too carefully about all of the ventures that we might have gotten into. You started to ask me a question.
What year did the co-op officially end?
I don't know. I think we could find out.
Early 60s?
Probably.
Was that about the time the Duncan Dam was under construction?
About then, yes.
Did that change things for you very much?
No. It's interesting. The Duncan Dam changed things a lot for people in Meadow Creek and Cooper Creek. But because the people in Argenta didn't look on it as a great opportunity to get rich quick, I don't know of anybody whose lifestyle was basically changed by the Duncan Dam coming in. Sure, it had one effect on Argenta. It put a double-lane paved road from within reach of Argenta to Caslow, which meant that whereas before it was probably an hour and a quarter to Caslow, it was about 45 minutes to Caslow, and it was that much easier for people who had interests other than, who were slightly interested in the community party, but also would prefer to be in the pub on a Saturday night. It made it that much easier to go to Caslow to the pub. So that's a sort of an indirect result of the dam. But the big boom that was in the Lardeau Valley left Argenta basically untouched. There was nobody who like some of the people that we know in Cooper Creek, who were getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning in order to feed 8 men breakfast in order to get them off to work, and making lunches for them and making dinner for them, and subdividing their property up into little bits and making trailer parks or all this sort of thing. Putting in a Mobile, there was a Mobile laundromat in Meadow Creek at one time, or Cooper Creek, I guess. All these things that people rushed around doing and got excited about during the dam building just didn't affect Argenta. As far as I know, David Stevenson got a job working as what's the lowest thing on a survey crew? Rodman on a survey crew on the dam, and thoroughly alienated himself by talking all the time to the men about how the dam was not a good move at all when it was supplying him and them with their salaries.
But Argenta did have a boom of its own later, I guess.
Well, Argenta has grown pretty steadily from the time we started arriving, and those people who have resented some of the aspects of it have always blamed the Quakers for dragging in everybody that they don't like. But I don't look on it as any one particular time as super booming anymore. Now, I don't know the statistics, but there were 4 families of us, including the Pollards, who were here just about within 13 months, say, first year. But within another year, the Wolfs were here, and my timing isn't too good, but Chuck Valentine and Hugh Elliott were here soon after that, and one by one, people have moved in, some of them to stay, most of them to stay.
Actors and Herbisons.
Herbisons, yeah. So that there was a gradual increase, and some people who did leave, the O'Neills and the ones that I think of earlier on, and the Rushes left too. But the large percentage of people who did get here stayed. And when you consider that the reason most people moved here is they heard about it from somebody, it's very natural that it should be an exponential growth to a certain extent, because there were more people here from whom to hear about it as the population grew. But I don't think that, in some ways, the spurt of the land co-op in the last 18 months is probably one of the biggest spurts of population. At least I felt before that I knew pretty well each family as they came in as a unit. But you want me to go over that again?
Yeah.
I was ruminating about one of the factors that probably made Delta weaker was the fact that we didn't do what we had planned to do, which was all of us to live quite close together. But it turned out that by the time Delta Co-op got started, and we had already bought and were living in the land right here, living in the old hotel, and living on the land right here. And if we had sold the hotel at the prices of that day, we couldn't have afforded to build much of a structure out of the flats. And the Pollards had bought their house, and the Rushes were not in a position to. They actually did start building out at the on the co-op land, north of the Boyd's house. And I think there are remnants of the foundation out there still. But and Chuck Valentine did start to develop a home site out there, but he was dropped from that Delta Co-op, and then he bought his place up the hill. And Hugh Elliott, when he came here, was not interested in living out in the flats. He was interested in a more scenic spot, and he purchased the land that he's on, so that there wasn't the sort of close community that comes from dropping in on people daily. Because you're walking past somebody's door, it's easy to drop in and say how are things going, and things that fester for a week if you're seeing each other less regularly, just are cleared up if you live next door. And as we kept finding other activities, such as the school for us, such as the post office for the Pollards, such as Bob's music teaching, we didn't see each other except for occasional cooperative meetings and occasional work days. We for a period of time, none of us were putting much time in the co-op, except we helped with haying, and if there was something to do with the small herd of cattle, we'd go out and do it on a Saturday afternoon or during the summertime or something like that. So that there was a period of time when all of us were doing something else a good deal of the time, but pitching in when something needed doing on the farm. So we were none of us working full time with the co-op, and because everybody was doing something else, and there was no point in the business of working half a week for the co-op and being supported by it, because we were being supported by something else. Nominally, when the school started, Helen and I were taking our salary that we got, putting it in the co-op and taking it back again as our minimal existence allowance. That's how the regional school's salaries of $75 a month were established, because that's what we'd been getting for the co-op, from the co-op for working half-time. And of course it turned out that Helen and I were each working full-time, so that was a quadrupling of labor for the same salary. But obviously we liked it, or we wouldn't have done it. And so that, and that was just typical. The Pollards weren't, there was no financial exchange between the Pollards and the co-op, because the post office just about paid their subsistence, and there was no point in bookkeeping it in and out. And Hugh Elliott never took any basic allowance anyway from the co-op, so that it gradually faded away. And just about the time that we got it incorporated, we decided to close it down. So the only thing that's left of the cooperative is the incorporation papers. We kept those going, so that we wrote the incorporation papers up in such a manner that any organization that wanted to do a business in Argenta practically could pick up the incorporation without having to go through the incorporation papers again. And if you want to lead on from that, you can ask Betty Polster about Glacier Industries, which was going to make...
Yes, I know about Glacier Industries. I came in the middle of that.
Sleeping bags and down jackets.
I slept in the midst of down pairs.
Connected with the history of the place.
But it must have been quite a trip with all the old cars.
Well, we had set ourselves to not drive more than 35 miles an hour maximum, unless we were going downhill under compression and forced to go faster. And we had hoped to make 125 miles a day coming up, but because there were at first there were 5 children and 4 adults, and later on we picked up Ted Pollard, So then that made 6 children when, by the time we crossed the border. There were lots of restroom stops and stops for this and that. And minor problems, we were very lucky we didn't have any big problems. But we drove, it took us the full 2 weeks from St. Patrick's Day to April Fool's Day to make the trip from, we went about 1,500 miles. And some days we only made 90 miles in a day. We had to stop early enough to shop around at all the motels to find out which one had the lowest off-season rate, because the Pollards didn't feel up to camping with Donnie, who was legally blind. And anyway, they were... George is almost 20 years older than I am. And so it was look for a motel starting about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And we went over 2 mountain passes. We had no trouble going up over them. Each of them were in the middle of snow. But there was always a question of going down afterwards. And that was a problem because I, for one, had a trailer that weighed 2.5 times what the car weighed. There were no brakes on the trailer. And the brakes on the car were mechanical brakes, which heat up and become inoperative if you use them very much. So Helen and I had a system whereby I signaled to her if I felt the car was getting out of control, and she passed me as soon as she could and put her car in low gear, and I was already in low gear. And I'd brake a little bit to bump into her gently, hopefully, and then we'd go winding down the downhill grades with 2 cars in low gear holding back the trailer, which weighed more than the 2 cars.